So you're a nonprofit in Oregon. You're probably thinking, we only need to register once we start asking for money, right? Well, that's a really common assumption, but for Oregon, it's just not true. Let's dig into what makes Oregon's rules so different. This explainer is part of our series on multi-state fundraising compliance. Today, we're zeroing in on the specific rules for Oregon. This is all brought to you by the specialists over at Ironwood Registrations. Okay, let's dive right in. For most nonprofits, there's this one big assumption. Registration is all about fundraising. But here's the thing. If you're doing anything in Oregon, that simple assumption can get you into a bit of trouble. This really brings us to the key question, doesn't it? Is registration only required when you're actively fundraising? And in Oregon, the answer is a big no. It's not what most people expect. It goes way beyond just asking for donations. And this is the absolute key difference. The common assumption is that solicitation, asking for money, is what triggers registration. But Oregon's rule, it's so much broader. You could find yourself needing to register even if you've never sent a single fundraising email in the state. Seriously. So, if it's not just about fundraising, what are the triggers? Let's take a look at the specific things that will require you to register with Oregon's Department of Justice. And wow, you can see right away just how broad this is. First off, if your organization is actually organized in Oregon, you have to register, period. No question. But for everyone else, look at this. Doing business or even just holding assets in the state are triggers. That's on the same level as actively soliciting contributions. Okay, so let's say you've determined you need to register. What happens next? Well, this is another spot where Oregon does things its own way. You can pretty much forget the idea of an annual renewal. It's more like a one-time registration, and then after that, it's all about annual reporting. So that first step is a one-time filing with the Oregon Department of Justice. You'll need to send in your core documents, things like your bylaws and your IRS determination letter. And here's a great tip if you're registering in multiple states. Oregon accepts something called the Unified Registration Statement, or URS. It can save you a ton of time on paperwork. And here's some really good news, especially for your budget. The fee for this initial registration? It's $0. That's right, a big goose egg. Oregon doesn't charge a filing fee to get registered. So it's really this simple two-step process. First, you do the initial registration. After that, it's just annual reporting. Once you're registered, you stay registered. No need to renew every year. You just file that annual report to stay in good standing. And that annual report is pretty straightforward. You're basically just submitting your latest IRS Form 990, some financial disclosures, and any updates to your key info. Things like a change in officers or directors. Of course, anytime there's a filing, we've got to talk about the important stuff. Deadlines, fees, and, well, what happens if you're late? So let's get into those details. The main deadline is easy to remember. Your annual report is due 4.5 months after your fiscal year ends. So for most of you who are on a calendar year, that's going to be May 15th. But what if you need more time? Well, Oregon is actually pretty flexible. You can get a full 180-day extension. All you have to do is request it, or even easier, just send them a copy of your federal extension. That's IRS Form 8868. All right, let's talk fees. Now, unlike that free initial registration, the annual report does have a fee. Oregon uses a sliding scale that's based on your revenue and assets. So for smaller orgs, it could be as low as $20, but for larger organizations, it can climb to $400 or even more. And trust me, you do not want to miss that deadline. The late fees escalate pretty fast. It starts at $20, but then it jumps to $50, and then $100 the longer it's overdue. It's a pretty clear signal that they want you to file on time. So at this point, you're probably wondering, hey, maybe my organization is exempt. And that's a great question to ask. But in Oregon, you'll find the list of exemptions is, well, it's a lot shorter than in most other states. And this is probably the most important thing to know about exemptions in Oregon. A lot of states have what's called a small charity exemption. If you raise less than a certain amount, you don't have to register. Well, Oregon does not have that. It doesn't matter if your contributions are big or small. There's no automatic pass just because you're small. Now, there are some exemptions, but they're very specific. We're talking about certain religious organizations, some educational institutions, and what are called mutual benefit corporations, which aren't 501c3s or C4s, and also some government-related entities. But even for these groups, some of them still have to file paperwork to officially claim that they're exempt.
Okay, so let's pull all this together. What are the key things you need to do to make sure you stay compliant in Oregon? Let's run through a quick checklist.
First up, get that initial registration done as soon as you meet one of those triggers. After that, it's all about filing those annual financial reports on time, every time. You'll also want to keep a close eye on your Oregon-specific revenue, since that affects your fees. And finally, just make sure you're maintaining accurate financial disclosures.
If you remember just one thing from this whole explainer, let it be this. Oregon's rules are just plain different. Being based there or even just holding assets in the state can trigger registration, completely separate from any fundraising you might be doing.
And that really leaves us with a final question for you. Knowing just how broad Oregon's rules are, have you really taken a close look at your own organization's activities to see if you're meeting all your compliance obligations there?
Look, handling Oregon's unique rules is definitely doable, but it really does require some careful attention to detail. If you'd rather just have an expert take care of it for you, that's exactly what Ironwood Registrations does. They specialize in keeping nonprofits compliant, not just in Oregon, but all across the country. You can learn more and get help over at ironwoodregistrations.com.